Hello, I'm Bill Cheall and this is a brief World War II welcome to the Fighting Through podcast. I just wanted to let you know that I'm currently covering my dad's war memoirs in full on the podcast in Fighting Through from Dunkirk to Hamburg. You can pick and choose your subjects if you like, but if you really want to start the book from page 1, then just nip back to episode 107. That's episode 107. Bye-bye for now. Chapter 20. D+1 to D+30. After a few hours of restless sleep, we were fully aroused by the night guard touching our feet, and very quickly we were on the alert. It was dawn, the most dangerous time not to have our wits about us. The gunfire had not yet rent the air, but it would not be very long. There would not be any bacon, eggs and sausage this morning because it would take time and security for the field kitchens to be set up. There would not be any washing or showering either. That would have to wait. And shaving, it was only fluff anyway, was out of the question at the present time while the invasion was at such a critical stage. Get up and go was the order of the day. During the 24 days I was in Normandy, the opportunity to wash hair or take a shower never arose. Other more important things occupied our time. We always had spare socks in our small pack though. There was soon frenzied activity. It was emergency rations for breakfast, as we well knew, so there wasn't any mourning. We ate chocolate, sweets, biscuits, and a small box of raisins. We knew that a good meal would be coming as soon as the situation improved. Our battalion commander, having attended orders group at brigade, passed on relevant information to the platoon officers, who then passed on to the troops whatever details concerned our activities and hopes for the day, enemy allowing. It was good, because we felt we were more than just a number in the infantry. Very often, when the enemy showed signs of resenting our presence, plans had to be altered, and we would understand the problems that sometimes caused. On D-Day, by early evening, other elements of 50 Division on our far right had liberated Arromanches, which was the proposed site of the prefabricated Mulberry Harbour. It was the first place to be liberated during the first day of the invasion. We now had our orders about the line of advance, who was to lead off and other details. So in the early morning of 7th of June, the company advanced, walking section after section alternately along either side of the narrow lanes, after a "good luck, lads" from our officer. On such occasions we always kept about 3 yards apart in case enemy shells landed near us, so there would be the minimum of casualties. In that respect, the bocage helped us. The hedgerows saved us many times from the effect of shelling. On the other hand, the hedges provided cover for snipers and anti-tank gun crews. Not that there were so many tanks at that early stage, unless they were operating in other areas. I saw very few on the first and second day. We kept to the country roads, often for concealment, but there were also times when it was essential to move across open countryside. On one particular day, we were crossing a field on an incline when we heard planes coming towards us. Looking skywards, we could see the white stripes, which were the Allied marking for all aircraft during the invasion. They were our planes all right, fighters, but not very friendly. In a matter of seconds they started to strafe us, and we dived for the ground and made some attempt at becoming ostriches, but they had killed 2 of our boys. When the planes had gone, what we said I dare not write. The RAF was not a popular topic of conversation at that moment. Obviously they must have mistaken us for enemy, But that was no consolation to us. Our officer, being a genuine sort of chap, said he thought that possibly there were enemy soldiers in the vicinity, so we deployed, crawling along muddy ditches in order to avoid being seen. We eventually surprised a patrol of 5 Germans who received the shock of their lives. They were not the arrogant type of German and quickly surrendered. In past years, wherever we'd fought the enemy, we'd never had the proliferation of air cover that we had in 1944, especially as soon as our aircraft were able to use the airfields in Normandy. Now, there were many new ideas coming to light relating to warfare, and we saw many of these being put into very good use. After the 3rd day or so, whenever we came upon a well-sighted pillbox putting up stubborn opposition that could cause us casualties, which we had to avoid whenever possible, a message was sent to the rear, and 1 or 2 typhoons would appear in no time. On this particular day, the enemy were ensconced in a farmhouse and were putting up serious defensive fire, and it was in a situation where we could not deploy around it without loss of life. Tanks would not approach too closely either, for danger of being fired upon by a hidden 88mm. Our CO, who sent a message to the rear, resolved the situation, and our eyes were soon opened to the concept of combined operations. We heard planes coming towards us within 15 minutes. There were 2 typhoons coming in low across the hedges and fields, and whoosh! Like flashes of lightning, 2 rockets went straight as an arrow towards the farmhouse and left a pile of smoking rubble where the farmhouse had been. If only our young pilots of 1940 had had such weapons at their disposal. I should think that form of attack was also new to the Germans, who'd had their days of glory when they had mastery of the air. How things had developed since the days of domination of the skies by the Stuka dive bomber. The above situation happened a countless number of times whenever we came across enemy strong points, such as farms and church towers. In fact, any kind of suspicious building was quickly dispatched by the typhoons. They were brilliant. I once saw a Tiger tank suffer the same fate, and there were no survivors, I can tell you. Our advance was not always without its problems. Frequently the enemy would be determined to hold us up. Then we would have to dig in, but the ground in Normandy, being agricultural, allowed us to entrench fairly quickly, just the opposite to North Africa, where much of what looked like deep sand soon became rock. One day I came upon 2 dead Germans lying on their backs, open eyes staring at the sky. I searched the bodies, mainly on the chance of coming across a Luger revolver, which would have been a prized souvenir, but I was out of luck. What I did find was a photograph of the 2 of them, and I still have it. I felt certain that somebody had been there before me, because their pockets were empty. It was the first time I'd done that sort of thing, but some of the lads regularly searched dead bodies. The advance was now only proceeding slowly because some units, and ours was one of them, were going too far ahead of the desired line. So to keep the front correct, we had to fall back a little in case the enemy decided to counterattack with a pincer movement and cut the leading units off. On this particular day, at about 1600 hours, we halted and dug in, making our trenches about 30 inches deep to hold 2 men sitting face to face. Soon after we'd finished, we heard planes coming in our direction, and could tell by the peculiar engine noise that they were Jerry's. It was a turn-up for the buck, because up until that time we'd not seen a German plane since we'd landed. Then they appeared, the black crosses and swastika so clear to us. Like a flash, they turned towards our lines, starting their dive just as they did at Dunkirk, when they'd caused such chaos by their domination of the skies. It was an extraordinary experience once again to see the bombs actually leave the plane and to be machine-gunned as the Stukas dived. They killed 3 of our lads. But the planes had no sooner pulled out of their dive than 2 Spitfires came tearing across the sky. The Stukas tried to avoid contact, but did not stand a chance against the Spitfires. It was as if our planes were playing cat and mouse with them, but eventually we saw the Stukas break up in the sky, then crash in flames. Although our confidence about the outcome was already at a peak, it was good to see our planes in such a decisive action, and during my remaining time in Normandy I never saw another German plane. They had had their day, and would never again strafe pitiful and helpless civilians. What planes they had left didn't stand a chance, as the retaliation was so swift and conclusive. This day, 7th of June, one of our brigades freed Bayeux, the first town to be freed during the invasion. The company settled down after the excitement and trauma of the day, and it was my turn to do guard with another lad. 2 hours on and 2 hours off, which was different to the usual 2 hours on and 4 hours off. In a situation such as we were in, it was always essential to be constantly on the alert. Being on duty in pitch dark, when every move is magnified out of all proportion, and a knife in the back is a distinct possibility, keeps a lad on his toes, every nerve straining for the sound of an enemy patrol. They too would be silent, listening for the slightest giveaway sound. Come the morning of the 3rd day, and surprise, surprise, the company cooks had been busy at B echelon just to the rear of us, and had brought up hot breakfast. The verdict was unanimous. It was great. Mind you, we were a bit hungry, and it was a sight for sore eyes. Once the field kitchens were operating, food was plentiful. Almost everything, so early in the campaign, was prepared from cans. Sausages, bacon, tomatoes, cheese, dried egg, milk, butter. There seemed to be no end to what could be packed into a can. Such canned food was unheard of in those days, and we'd never seen canned bacon. It was out of this world to us, delicious, and as much as we wanted, with an ample supply of good fresh white bread. I'll bet the Germans could have done with some of that instead of their black bread. I seem to recall that only the precious tea and sugar were a loose commodity. But to us lads, what was as important as the food was the fact that some brilliant chaps had thought what a morale-boosting exercise it would be for the men at the sharp end to receive mail from loved ones. Really, the whole effort had been well organised. Needless to say, the cooks went to the top of the class, and in our present frame of mind were promoted immediately to full sergeants. We did have our lighter moments, even under the strain of war. So began another day. The expectation of enemy shelling was always present, and we had not gone far when that expectation became realisation and orders came for us to dig in, just in case the shelling, which was heavier than usual, was the forerunner to a counter-attack. But after less than half an hour, in fact we'd only just finished our trenches, the fire ceased. Just as well for the Jerrys, because the shelling had killed some of our boys and our adrenaline was at its maximum. They would have paid very dearly for the lives they'd taken. It did appear, though, that the enemy was showing signs of recovery from the shock of the assault upon the Atlantic wall, and we were held in our position for 4 days. No explanation was given or expected. The enemy never did what we thought they would do, so we just waited and listened to the shells flying back and forth overhead. The mortars were always a problem, and we suffered a number of casualties. The stalemate was eventually resolved in our favour, and we pushed forward once again, always with the utmost caution, taking many German prisoners. On the 11th of June, C Company was moving forward in our usual extended line across fields, and upon reaching a cornfield, continued to walk through the corn, which was waist high, until we were half across. Then all hell let loose upon us from trees 100 yards ahead, among which were snipers and machine gun posts. The snipers were after the NCOs and officers, and they were very successful too. It happened so suddenly, and the first officer to be killed by a shot in the head was our company commander, Captain Chambers, who'd taken over charge of C Company on the beach when Captain Lynn was killed. We also lost a Norwegian officer attached to us. We all called him Norgie, a first-class officer and a gentleman. Several NCOs and other ranks were also the victims of the attack, including Major Honeyman and Corporal Alexander. Major Young, Bert Hall and a score of others were wounded. Our company sergeant major was shot through the throat. It was quite a nightmare while it lasted. The angels must have been looking after me that day. The remainder of the company dropped down into the corn and crawled out to escape. We were the lucky ones. We could all so easily have been killed. It was a severe warning to us not to drop our guard for a minute, because Jerry was still a crafty devil and would make us pay dearly for any laxity. It was also a warning to steer clear of cornfields. I can't imagine why we had to go across a cornfield at all, when all the enemy had to do was lob over a few mortars. It could have been catastrophic to us had the corn set alight. Minor counter-attacks developed, and the odd German plane came over, and of course the 88mm guns of the enemy were always a danger to us. On our right, German tanks broke through the positions of 8th Armoured Brigade and caused a dangerous situation, so much so that we had to withdraw to straighten the line. We counter-attacked, and the fighting was severe and determined, and lasted all day. One platoon of A Company was surrounded for a while. All in all, it was a bad day for us, with a high proportion of officers and NCOs being killed, and altogether 250 were killed or wounded. Our B Company took 20 prisoners, all arrogant young Nazis. That happened on the 12th of June, and we then dug in and consolidated our positions, after which time we were relieved in the line for 36 hours by a battalion of the 49th Division. Although we were able to get some sleep in, we were still harassed by the enemy shelling and mortars. Because of the serious casualties, particularly in officers and NCOs, the battalion commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Hastings, had to reorganise the company when once again we were spread out rather more thinly until reinforcements could arrive. It took some days to put the cornfield fiasco to the back of our minds. One day, our section was walking along the right-hand side of a lane, and we were going around a bend when on another turning ahead of us was a 70-ton Tiger tank about 150 yards away. He was so quiet and hardly moving. I don't know who was the most surprised, the tank commander or us, but as soon as he saw us, he started to reverse, probably thinking we had an anti-tank weapon, because I was in the lead and was carrying my 2-inch mortar. Or probably all he wanted was information concerning our position, since they did not have the spotter planes they had in earlier years. I'm pleased he didn't open fire. I don't think I would be sitting here writing now if he had. The tank soon disappeared, and I told my officer what I'd seen, because as he was further back, he'd not seen the incident. Soon afterwards, a barrage of heavy fire was laid down upon our area, killing 3 of our lads, whereupon our officer reported to the commanding officer, and very quickly our own heavy guns were giving the enemy more than they'd bargained for. Perhaps after we'd reported the sighting, we should have redeployed. Later, we advanced over the ground ahead of us and found several Germans dead. For 2 or 3 days, we just moved forward, sorting out pockets of enemy resistance, killing or taking prisoners. Things were certainly going our way, but sometimes at a cost to us in casualties. Nothing of any real significance occurred, but we were never free of enemy fire, and we'd become so used to it that it didn't bother us unduly. Whenever there was any feverish activity, our morale still remained high, as it should. The adrenaline quickly flowed as soon as danger threatened. It was an instinctive reaction. The hedgerows and fairly narrow lanes seemed to go on, and extreme caution was always essential. A second too slow and you were dead. We carefully turned another bend. These narrow lanes seemed to be all bends, and our lead man observed a German machine gunner behind a tree, his hands still in the firing position. Yet there wasn't any movement from him. Taking no chances, we went round the back of him, keeping very low, and saw that he was dead. A knife sticking in his back, his hands still holding his Spandau. He certainly got his just deserts. I reckoned he missed the main course. As we were walking the line of a hedge, I saw some of our tanks moving across a field, and suddenly heard the crack of an 88mm anti-tank gun. We'd become so used to the sound of German weapons that we instinctively knew what weapon was being fired. Then I saw one of the tanks receive a direct hit and go up in flames, but not before 2 of the crew came out of the side, like jackrabbits. How they bailed out is a mystery. They must certainly have practised that performance during their training. I had always been of the opinion that our role as infantrymen placed us in the most vulnerable position, but after I saw that tank blown up, I was not quite so sure. But unlike us, the tank crews were not continually on Shank's ponies. We certainly covered some mileage in the PBI. Poor bloody infantry. Our boots were already the worse for wear, and our battle dresses were becoming very shabby and dirty. After we had lagered at the end of the day, and we'd been given a meal of bully stew, I went on many patrols during both the evening and at night time, looking for signs of the enemy positions. This was when the skills of the attacker were pitted against those of the defender, a cat-and-mouse game, with possible death as the penalty. The enemy too had the same dangerous game to play, keeping tabs on each other's movements at all times. Strange as it may seem, there was never any shortage of volunteers for patrol. The opportunity to outwit the enemy was a challenge, and linked with the danger never failed to pump the adrenaline through our veins. It was especially gratifying when we could also collect a few prisoners. We were as good as or better soldiers than the enemy, and needed to prove it. Sometimes we lost men on these patrols, and it was always sad. There was one particular patrol I was on when we ran into trouble. Our section was walking along the back of a hedge for cover, when suddenly a Spandau machine gun opened up on us from the far corner of the field. Our instantaneous reaction was to dive into the bottom of the ditch, but not before 3 of our lads were killed. Their bodies were recovered later. After that failed recce, we reported as usual to our platoon officer, whose response was immediate. I and another lad guided a strong patrol, accompanied by 2 Bren gunners, and pointed out where we'd got into trouble. Using sign language, we were deployed around the area of the enemy position, with the result that our Bren gunner was able to dispatch the enemy machine gun post, killing 2 Germans. I cannot possibly list all our activities in the days that followed without consulting the history books, and that is not my intention. The period was full of activity, during which time we were never far from the sounds of war, much of which was the artillery of both sides. There were many occasions when we came up against some stubborn opposition, in the form of a strongly defended farmhouse or a couple of hull-down tanks stationed just below the brow of a hill, when an exchange of fire would develop. At that stage of the war, the eventual result was that the enemy would either be taken prisoner or liquidated if they tried to hold out against superior forces. Whenever we halted, as we did not know how close we were to the enemy, patrols went out to probe the land. On one of these, on 26th of June, Corporal Miller went out with 6 men and was killed by a sniper. Poor lad! But we'd become so used to seeing sudden death that it did not play on our thoughts for long. We also lost good old Corporal Shaw around this time. Many prisoners were taken, and some of them were Russians who were fighting for Germany rather than go back to Russia. Others were young fanatical Germans about 16 or 17 years of age. Of course, young bodies were lying around all over the place. What a waste! The enemy was still being very active, which caused us to dig in every time we stopped for a short period. This meant digging a hole big enough to hide our body, using our entrenching tool, which we all carried with us. If we met any serious opposition, a message would be sent back, and help in the way of planes, tanks, or 25-pounder artillery would sort them out, although many times it was up to ourselves to fight it out. It was now 30th of June, and we'd halted during a lull in the aggression from both sides in the conflict. We spread out, overlooking a field, about 4 yards apart, along one of the ditches which seemed to be never-ending. But even when resting, we had to be constantly on the alert. From this position, my section was sent on a patrol during daylight at about 10:30 hours, and was fired upon by the enemy, so we retraced our steps and made a report to our officer. But it appears that we must have been observed returning to our units because of the shelling which followed. Half an hour later, a pal and I were sitting on the bank of a ditch, with our backs to the hedge, having our tiffin, when it happened. We all knew that as long as we could hear shells passing overhead, they were not meant for us. If they were, we would not hear them, and would not feel much when it happened, because it was so sudden. Well, one came over which I didn't hear. The first thing I knew was that I'd been thrown into the air and had landed 5 yards away. I'd not felt a thing, but knew that I'd been wounded, feeling blood running down my leg, but no pain at all. I'd been hit on the inside of my left thigh, very near to you-know-what. It was incredible how quickly it happened. The blast and shrapnel wounded my pal also. I think how easily I could have been killed. Still, I would not have known anything about it. Somebody called for the stretcher-bearer, which they should not have done, in case the sound carried to the enemy. The first-aid soldier came up, tore my trousers off and put a first-aid dressing on my wound. Everyone carried a large field dressing in a special pocket as part of our battle dress. The wheels of organisation quickly got moving, and in no time at all a 4-wheel drive jeep came up to the scene, and we were both put on a stretcher and fastened to the framework erected on the jeep for the purpose, and away we went. It was a very strange feeling to me at the time. I don't remember whether I was sad or glad that I'd been wounded, but I knew that I experienced a great feeling of regret when the jeep drove across the field, and I shouted, "So long, lads," and I never saw them again. They were probably thinking, "Lucky bugger, he's out of it," which when it comes to the crunch was true, because I could so easily have been killed that day. Now my future lay wherever my fate took me. I was taken to a field hospital, which was a hive of activity. Well, it would be, wouldn't it? The Royal Army Medical Corps, the RAMC, was dedicated to taking care of the wounded. A young lad came and cut my trousers off. Then the medical officer examined my wound, which was now becoming painful. A large field dressing was put on, and I was given a morphine injection and went to sleep. My last day in the invasion was almost over. I had done my bit. It seemed so long since the 1st of June, when I'd boarded Empire Lance at Southampton. The beginning of quite an experience, and I was feeling very tired. I could not remember when I had last had a night's sleep, or even taken my clothes off. It had been an experience I would treasure. What I had done and seen would be of immense value in years to come. The events would be my ghosts of the future, and I went to sleep. So ended my part in the invasion. It was 30th of June, 1944. Chapter 21. My Rest Cure. Away from the sounds of war, I'd slept well between white sheets, but as soon as my eyes opened, I felt the pain of my wound. I saw the medical officer appear. He was going from bed to bed, asking how we were feeling and giving instructions to the orderlies, one of whom dressed my wound and gave me a morphine injection. I was not feeling too good, and another orderly brought me a cup of hot sweet tea and made me as comfortable as possible. Those orderlies may not have been in the firing line, but they had the skills to do a different kind of job under very difficult circumstances in the field. Sometime during the morning, an ambulance man came, took 6 of us, and headed for the coast. When I had been wounded, our battalion was in a position near Villers-Bocage, a few miles from the coast, and the trip back to the beaches was slow because the roads were congested with military traffic, mainly the RASC carrying supplies, which had priority, so it took us some considerable time to reach Arromanches, site of the British Mulberry Harbour. As I was being transferred to the ship, I felt the ambulance going over the hollow-sounding, floating roadway. As I went over, I was determined to try and have a look at the Mulberry. This prefabricated port was an amazing feat of engineering. Many years later, 40 in fact, and the first time I had returned to Normandy, all that remained of that magnificent harbour were the huge blocks of concrete, which will remain for many years to come as a monument to man's genius. My imagination ran wild. After I'd been settled in a bunk, the effects of the morphine and the motion of the hospital ship soon sent me to sleep. I was most surprised when I was awakened to be told that we'd arrived at Southampton, from where I had originally sailed to Normandy. It seemed ages ago. 2 orderlies carried my stretcher off the ship and put me into one of a fleet of ambulances which was soon on its way to a Canadian hospital just outside of Southampton. It was a brand new complex, built for the specific purpose of receiving casualties, and was made up of numbers of well-built wooden structures, each about twice the size of a Nissen hut, all on ground level. It was situated in lovely countryside, and each building was joined by a corridor to the next. It was the 22nd Canadian General Hospital, and its entire staff were Canadian, devoted to their calling, who treated us all with the utmost care and consideration for our comfort, showing gratitude for what we were, wounded soldiers who had at first hand experienced the horrors of war and who now needed their skilled attention. First of all, I was appointed and introduced to a Canadian orderly. He was a young man named Leslie Buckler. I was put on a blanket-covered couch, then stripped and bathed. All my clothes were thrown into a bin, and a new field dressing was put on my wound, which was giving me some pain. They put a nightshirt on me, then took me to a ward, and put me into a lovely clean bed with white sheets and pillowcases. To me it was luxury. It was almost worth being wounded for, and a far cry from the fighting of 2 days ago. After a short while, a medical officer came and examined my wound, which was bleeding again, and beginning to cause me some distress. Within 1 hour, I was having an X-ray to determine the extent of penetration of the shrapnel. I was no sooner back in my bed than I was out again onto a trolley and given the usual pre-med jab to make me drowsy before being taken to the operating theatre, where a surgeon told me about my wound. At this point, I could not feel my leg at all. Then 2 bottles were set up, one containing blood, the other with penicillin dripping into my arm. The mask was put over my face, and that was all I knew until I woke up. As is usual after surgery, I didn't quite know where I was, and after a little while my orderly came to me and said, "Well, William Cheall," he'd obviously taken this from my paybook, "you are all done and dusted." And then he handed me something wrapped in a bit of gauze for a souvenir. It was the piece of shrapnel recovered from my wound, from an 88mm shell, about 1.5 inches long and over 1/4 of an inch thick. Leslie Buckler asked me if I realised how lucky I'd been, because the shrapnel, had it hit me 1 inch higher, would have prevented me from being a parent. When the surgeon came to see me, he said that the piece of steel had penetrated so far into my upper thigh that they had had to put a 4-inch cut in my backside to remove it. I still have the shrapnel for a souvenir, and also the 2 scars of my wound. This was my first contact with the Canadians, and I found them to be very efficient and caring. The hospital unit was run entirely by men, and my orderly waited on me hand and foot. I've been empathetic towards Canada ever since. This hospital was only a reception place to sort out various wounded men, so after 3 days, when I had fully recovered my senses and been given a light meal, no time was lost in putting me in yet another ambulance to a waiting Red Cross hospital train, taking me to goodness knows where. Again, the staff on the train was very caring. Nothing was any trouble, and I was soon settled in a bunk, so it was great to be mollycoddled. I lay awake listening, pondering over past events and wondering where they were taking me. Life in the army was like a mystery tour, but usually with more serious consequences. I was able to talk to the other wounded in bunks near me. Although they were not Green Howards, they were 50th Division men. Lunch was brought to us, and then it was time for a kip. When the stopping of the train woke me up, I heard the nurses calling, "Come on, lads, you've arrived." But there was not a great deal of enthusiasm amongst us. We just waited to see where we were and to be stretchered off the train. We'd arrived at Dundee in Scotland, and at that time it was a puzzle to me why, given all the hospitals there were in England, they had to send us 550 miles all the way to Scotland. When I was at Inveraray the previous February, I thought I'd seen the last of Scotland. Because of our experiences during the 2-week commando course, I was not particularly enamoured with the country. It had never dawned on me then, when I was at the peak of fitness, that I would be returning wounded so soon. As soon as the ambulance stopped on the forecourt, young Scots girls opened the doors and gave us welcoming smiles. "Come on, boys, cheer up, we'll take care of yous." Tucking a blanket around me on a stretcher, they handled me as if I was made of china and took me into Dundee Royal Infirmary, where I was quickly put into a small ward with 2 other lads. A doctor soon came to my bed and checked my documents and asked me how I felt, after which a nurse gave me a morphine injection and I settled down to sleep. It was 5th of July, 5 days after I'd been wounded. Next morning, 2 nurses, bright and breezy Scots girls, came to my bed, 1 on each side, and and pulled the curtain round and the bedclothes down. No half measures with those girls. They'd come to dress my wound, and it caused me to be a little embarrassed, but not them. Up with my shirt, and there I was, almost naked. It was a new experience for me, but I soon got used to it. Then a Then a drip was set up at the bottom of the bed. One nurse held my thigh, whilst the other inserted a thick needle, which must have been 1/8 of an inch thick. I hadn't felt the shrapnel go in because it was so sudden, but I certainly felt that needle. "There you go, soldier, you'll survive." I was on the penicillin drip for 7 days, though after 48 hours I was able to sit up at 45 degrees, but my wound was very painful. It transpired that my 2 roommates were also from 50th Division and in the Durham Light Infantry. They too had been wounded in the legs and were Geordies from Newcastle. Good lads, the Tynesiders. I'd learned long ago how thoroughly reliable and dependable Geordies were. Their temperament was quickly aroused when facing the enemy, and they were first-class scrappers. At the end of 7 days I was put into the main ward, where there were 30 other wounded, so there was no shortage of topics of conversation, though they were mostly muted, as some of the boys didn't feel inclined to talk and were rather depressed. After losing an arm, or leg, or both, who would want to talk his head off? All the other wounded came from various units of 50th Division, so the conversation was almost all about 50th Division and their officers, how they were wounded, their experience of D-Day, and the days following. I seem to recall that they all thought of their pals who were fighting in Normandy. Those boys, all around 19 or 20 years of age, faced a very uncertain future. They had bad dreams about what they'd seen and been involved in, calling out during the night. I remember one boy shouting, "Christ, I've lost my bloody legs!" Then he would wake up, and beside the bed would be 2 of those fantastic nurses, putting an arm round him for comfort. I now had time to take stock of the situation I had got into. Up until now I had been drowsy all the time. I thought back to the time I was wounded and my experiences since I went on that patrol. I thought about all I'd seen since D-Day. It had been an awful experience, and I was very lucky indeed to come out of it alive. Sleep did not come easy during those nightmarish nights. One boy had been blinded and could not accept that he would never see again. What a traumatic transformation for fit young men to be penalised for the remainder of their lives. I could go on recalling the dreadful wounds I saw. What would these young boys do with their broken bodies? That was the part of war we would all remember. The nurses never seemed to get tired of looking after us. They constantly patrolled the ward, looking at the distress and anxiety in some of the boys' faces. I looked around me at the other boys in the ward, and they were all soldiers who'd received all kinds of wounds. One lad opposite me had lost a leg. Boy, was I lucky! And he could not accept the fact for days that he only had one leg, as he could still feel the missing one. As I said, we were really looked after here. It was my first taste of Scottish hospitality, and it was great. During the night, some of the wounded would moan or groan and shout out. It was really depressing to hear about some of the casualties. Although my wound was bothering me a lot, at least I felt confident that I would make a good recovery, but to lose a limb when one was only around 20 years of age must have been dreadful. It was all so very sad. The nurses were wonderful, and we received almost personal attention. We only had to move, and our nurse was beside the bed to tend to our needs. I seemed to have one particular nurse looking after me. Like all the other girls, she was a Scot. She told me that her hometown was at Dufftown in Banff, about 160 miles east of Inverness, and she was 21 years of age. Early every morning, 2 nurses would come to the bed to put me in order and give me a wash. My nurse, Mary Wiseman, would clean up my wound and put on a new dressing. Then, to my great surprise, she kissed my face. All the girls did that to their boys. I think it must have been part of the recuperation process. When Mary was on duty, she always brought me a meal. At night, she would tuck me in, give me a kiss, and touch my face. Of course, all the boys received the same attention, but I was beginning to think Mary was sweet on me. It was great, and I enjoyed the attention. It made me feel good and helped to make my 3 weeks' stay very pleasant indeed. Many nights there was not a great deal of sleep for us, as some of the boys were dreaming, and their nightmares caused them to scream out loud. But this was well understood by us, and they received everybody's sympathy. They were great lads, and had made enormous sacrifices for their country. Before long, I was feeling better in myself, though my wound still bothered me a great deal. I was able to limp around the ward a little, and would make an effort to get some of the badly wounded to come to terms with what had happened to them. But they were in such deep shock, it was beyond my capability to ease their tortured minds. It would take time, and even then the healing of their broken bodies would be long and in many cases painful. It had been 3 weeks since my arrival, and the beds were needed for a continuous stream of wounded soldiers, so it was time for me to be moved on. I will always remember the very great kindness and understanding shown to all of us by the hospital staff during the initial stages of our treatment. As we hobbled onto the forecourt, each nurse gave their boys a kiss, and the departure was most touching. I was now taken by ambulance to a convalescent home. It seemed a long time since I was sitting in the back of a 3-tonner on the morning of D-Day, although it was only 2 months since. Until I went to Dundee, I had only been to Scotland for training, but of course I'd heard all about it from the various Scots lads I'd met in the army, who were always canny lads. My dealings with the Scots I'd met in Dundee confirmed my opinion that they were a generous race of people. It was a glorious morning travelling through the hills and countryside of Scotland, and I was in a very reflective mood. In fact, all 10 of us in the truck seemed engrossed with our own thoughts, going over and over the past weeks, totally absorbed about where we'd been and where we were going. My immediate future was very certain. I was going somewhere in a 3-tonner, my life in the hands of the army. For the past 5 years I'd been number 439 or 717. How much longer would it last? It just seemed to go on and on. I was taken to the village of Killin, and how I would remember that name in years to come. It was situated on the southern end of Loch Tay in Perthshire, and our new home, Auchmore House, was about 1.5 miles from Killin. Auchmore House was a large old residence, and in its heyday must have been magnificent, and in a way still was, situated in its own extensive grounds. Like the hospital, it was staffed by excellent, caring nurses, and we were there to convalesce. It was a rest home for about 50 soldiers, and it proved to be a good move being sent here. We were all accommodated in small rooms, and as we were here to recuperate, a great deal of leisure time was available, during which we would just read, write, or play cards, but were free to do almost as we wished, though we had a set routine of light exercises and massaging every day according to our wounds. But there was a good deal of free time to do as we pleased. There was a well-stocked library, a wireless and a gramophone with a good selection of records. These leisure activities may not seem very exciting, but to us, who had been used to a strict army routine, they were ideal under the circumstances, and they were conducive to recuperation. When I was not reading the books in the library, most of my time was passed making notes and writing of my kaleidoscope of experiences over the past weeks while they were fresh in my mind. We could walk in the grounds, which were extensive, and I found a huge pine tree which had been planted by Queen Victoria. I thought, to think that I'm standing where that great Queen has stood. The ink spots were all the rage then. Better songs than the tuneless stuff they churn out today. Again, the nurses were fantastic, so kind and generous with their patience and understanding. 2 weeks had gone by when I received a letter which had been posted in Scotland. I've always examined the franking of letters before I open them, but it was Scotland all right, and it was from my favourite nurse, Mary Wiseman, wanting to know if she could travel to Killin and stay for the weekend. I had never dreamt of any such thing taking place. Once I had said goodbye at the infirmary, Mary had only remained a lovely memory. Anyway, I thought she had been very caring to me, and I couldn't possibly have refused. I had a slow walk into the village, the only time I managed it, and the furthest I had walked since being wounded. It was also the first time I had seen Killin. The river was flowing fast over the rocks and under the bridge, on its way to Loch Tay. It was soothing to watch. Turning left at the bridge, I walked slowly up a slight incline, on one side of which were nice little bungalows. About halfway up, I chose one with a well-cared-for front garden. I said to myself, this is the one, and wondered if I was being too presumptive about the possibility. Realising I had a bit of a nerve, I knocked on the door, and a very motherly lady appeared. I explained how I came to know Mary, and that she was a Scot from Banff, and asked if she would let Mary have a room for a night. She replied that she would be only too pleased to help. The room had a beautiful view of the mountains from the window, and would be ideal. Facing the front of the bungalow, but a little distance away, the hills rose gently, the guardian of the mountains beyond. It was a picture to delight the eye, and a tonic to my recovery. Mary arrived on the Saturday morning. I hadn't seen her in ordinary clothes before, and she looked lovely, and was delighted with the place I'd chosen for her. Then the lady asked us to have lunch with her at her own table. Over the meal I explained about the routine of Auchmore, and that I was not allowed to stay out overnight, and had to be indoors by 10 p.m. It was a pity that I also had to go back to Orkmore for my treatment, but I was back with Mary by 2:30 p.m. It seemed that the best thing to do after lunch was to go for a steady walk up the hillside above the bungalow and become acquainted with each other's background. It was a lovely day for such a slow stroll. It would certainly avoid any aggravation to my leg, and it was a joy to be holding hands. How could I have ever imagined such a situation not so long ago? The ground was a mass of heather and bracken, and the mountains beyond were just stunning, forming a valley at the bottom of which Killin nestled. How could there be a dreadful war taking place? And what would the people of Europe give for such peace and tranquillity? I lay on my back and closed my eyes, saying to myself, "Thank you, God, for watching over me." I was carried away by my inner thoughts. Then Mary lay down beside me, putting her head on my shoulder, wanting to know what I was thinking. So I told her of my experiences. She kissed me and said, "Bill, I love you." And I squeezed my arm around her. We just lay talking, and Mary told me of some of the terribly wounded boys she'd been privileged to care for. The truth is, we just lay and kissed and cuddled, and when I could sense that things might get out of control, I just said, "Sorry, Mary," and I explained that I was not able to become too involved. My thoughts of the past, present and future dominated all other personal feelings, and she, being a country person, understood exactly how I felt. We were two people who could be in control of our mood. Although I thought that Mary had been growing fond of me while I was in hospital, I had no intention of letting things get out of hand. We just sat and kissed, happy to be in each other's company. We sat up, my arms around her shoulders, silent for a few minutes. And I think she greatly appreciated the fact that I had control. From where we sat, with the mountains behind us and the ground in front drifting down into Killin, it was heaven. It was beautiful, and we could have sat there forever, just looking at the scenery, absorbing every detail. I had a very clear conscience about having upheld my moral principles. I'd been reared that way. It was time to go, and holding hands again, we walked quietly down the hill. When I was in hospital, I had thought that Mary was a bit keen on me, but only because of my position as a wounded soldier. It had come as a shock when she told me that she loved me. But although I was very close to returning the affectionate expression, I held back. There was so very much of my life yet to be lived, and in my case I was not at all sure what the future held for me. The weekend had been lovely and memorable, but it had passed only too quickly. I took Mary to her room, where I gave her a huge hug, which I hoped said more than words. The kindly lady gave us lunch again. Then it was time to go and catch the bus. I did love Mary Wiseman, so it came as no surprise when she told me how she felt towards me. The weekend had been lovely, and we walked back slowly down the hill, alongside the rushing river and into the village. I gave Mary another kiss, and she climbed onto the bus, shedding a tear. A lovely memory had gone. Had I been kind or cruel? that was the last time I saw the first love of my life. And I haven't forgotten how fate sent me to Scotland, a land of beauty, with lovely Scots lasses. After the bus left, I walked slowly back over the bridge and past the flowing river Dochart. I was enjoying the meander back to Orkmore, and it gave me time to contemplate the events which had taken place since I went to Dundee. I stood for a while, my thoughts in turmoil about Mary. It had been the first time I had been so close to a girl, and I felt a little unsure. Yet given all the circumstances, I was of the opinion that I'd behaved in a proper manner. I could have so easily pursued this friendship, but the war was still on, and I knew I would be going back to my battalion, so this was no time to be thinking of girls. Turning left off the main road out of the village, I walked down the wooded lane. I remained a little sad and in deep thought until I saw the nurses at Orkmore. It was my birthday, 25th of August. Not a soul knew, so it passed just like any other day. After a few days, Mary wrote to me, and the gist of the letter was that she wanted to become more involved. But I needed time to think about the correct thing to do. In case orders came through for us to move on, the nurses at Orkmore paraded all their patients on the forecourt and took photographs. "Come along, boys, we need snaps of you before you go." Small groups of us went to the front of the building where the nurses arranged us. They were all treasures and later sent me copies of the snaps. Their kindness knew no bounds, and it would be a wrench leaving Killin. Next day we were issued with new uniforms and knew that we would soon be leaving the paradise called Orkmore. Before I was posted, I thought it best to write to Mary, explaining the dilemma I was in, that although I loved her, we had not known each other long enough to commit ourselves to a relationship. Also, I told her that when my recovery was complete, I would be going back to Europe and the war, and I could even be killed. I could not make any firm promises which I knew might have a profound effect upon her life. I never discovered Mary's reaction because she did not reply to my letter. For a long time it was on my mind if I'd done the right thing, but common sense prevailed, and gradually I accepted it. In the months that followed, whenever I felt in a reflective mood, I often thought of Mary, and under the circumstances prevailing at the time, I was certain I'd acted wisely. It just would not have worked, as we could not have spent any time to get to know each other, because our homes were so far apart. I was sorry to leave Killin. The Scotland I had seen in such a short space of time would always remain a treasured memory. And listener, there's a PS from me. My mum is not called Mary. So there was another girl entered Dad's life. End of chapter 21.